Yes.
Good evening. Welcome to our Regis Pride Faculty Lecture Series. Tonight's lecture is entitled Race, Redlining, and COVID, How the Pandemic Has Worsened the Housing Crisis for People of Color. My name is Mary Erin Driscoll, and I'm the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Regis College. I welcome all of our attendees tonight, including our students, our staff, our faculty, our Board of Trustees, our alums, our LARC students, community members, and friends of the college. I also want to give a special shout out to Dr. Mary Lou Jackson, the Special Assistant to the President in charge of Mission for Regis College. As many of you know, when we launched this most unusual semester, we decided to develop a multidisciplinary faculty-taught course on the pandemic and the disparities that it has made so painfully evident. Dr. Jackson, who shepherded that effort, also took on the task of doing this companion series of lectures for those who were not able to attend the course. And it will continue throughout the year on themes that have been explored or are ancillary to those that have been explored in the course. So thank you, Dr. Jackson. Allow me to go over a few Zoom details. This lecture is being recorded. All participants have been muted, so we do not get a lot of background noise. For the first hour, Professors Kohler and Kubick will share their lecture. For this portion, we ask that you stop video and use speaker view for your screen. Following the lecture, we will use the remaining time to answer questions or share your comments. You're welcome to turn your videos back on at that time. Please use the chat box at the bottom below during the lecture to ask questions or offer comments you may have. Dr. Megan Gibbons will be monitoring the chat box. We'll get to as many questions and comments as possible after the lecture. So let me introduce our two esteemed speakers. Dean William Kohler. William Kohler is the Dean of the Sloan School of Business and Communication and Professor of Management at Regis College. He received his PhD in labor history from Brandeis University and has also attended the University of Chicago, Boston University, and Franklin and Marshall College. His teaching and research interests include entrepreneurship, marketing strategy, and the role of business in promoting social, environmental, and economic justice. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Kohler was an executive recruiter and entrepreneur for nearly 2 decades, having launched 3 successful businesses and a nonprofit focused on equitable community development. He currently consults with small businesses and nonprofit organizations in Greater Boston. Professor Christopher Kubick. Chris Kubick joined Regis College in September 2018 with his appointment as Professor of Finance and Accounting in the Marshall M. Sloan School of Business and Communication. In addition to his professorial role, Chris serves as the director of the CFP, that's Certified Financial Planner, registered program. His primary teaching interests include corporate finance, investment management, personal finance, and financial and managerial accounting. His research interests include behavioral finance, wealth distribution, and tax policy. Prior to joining Regis College, Chris served as professor and dean of the School of Business at Mount Ida College and is a tenured associate professor and chair of the Department of Business Administration at Colby Sawyer College. Before working in higher education, Chris worked in operations and finance in corporations, in senior finance and economic positions in state government, and as a registered lobbyist at the state and national level, where he focused his legislative efforts on transportation-related issues. He holds a BS in International Business and Economics from Madonna University, an MBA from the University of Detroit, and a DBA from Anderson University. So it is with great pride and pleasure that I introduce Dean Bill Kohler and Professor Chris Kubick for tonight's Pride Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Driscoll. And thank you to my
colleague, Dr. Kohler, for doing this talk with me. I will start by letting you know that while this topic is certainly an interest and a passion of mine, I am not a foremost expert on it, but I have an interest and it's of significant importance to many, and so I'm pleased to present tonight. So am I sharing my screen, Bill? Do we see things? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So let me go ahead and get started. Thanks again, Dr. Driscoll and Dr. Jackson for the series and the introductions. So I thought I would begin the discussion of the topic by simply starting with the person in the center of the screen here, Dr. Ben Carson, who quite literally is a brain surgeon, or was a brain surgeon. He's not active in that role anymore. He currently leads he's as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And one might say, after hearing this speech for Dr. Kohler and I tonight, that maybe we need more brain surgeons in that role, because historically, this department that impacts so many lives and safety and health of American citizens has not always done the best job. And so with that, let me move on. I think before we can talk about housing and redlining and the discrepancies that exist for many, we have to have a basic understanding of economics, because a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about really began with economic policies that were designed and passed based on economic realities at the time. So on the right, for those of you that weren't economics majors or really, tried to look the other way, is the basic economic cycle. Things are good for a while, they reach a point and something happens. What that something is, can change over time. I can tell you the current state that we're in, that change from the top to negative economic activity or reduced economic activity was COVID, right? So, but it's not always that kind of thing. Sometimes it's a war, sometimes it's, other collapses, political regime changes, oil, energy policy. So all kinds of things happen that cause economic cycles to change. Well, what happens when we have an economic change and a cycle change is it tends to feed off of itself. So we have some people that start getting unemployed because something happened. Well, when they are unemployed, then they no longer can purchase things that they used to, which causes a shop owner perhaps to have to let somebody else go because there's not the same level of economic activity for that local store, which simply kind of creates a compounding effect through the economy. And once it hits the macro scale at the national level, we can see the large impact. So it really is, as this slide depicts, a vicious cycle. When the things start to turn sour, they turn sour rather quickly. And there's a lot of psychological element to that as well, that even if I'm safe economically right now, I might choose to stop my economic purchases to save just in case down the road something happens to me. So there is some psychology that's involved as well, but those are the basics of the economic cycle and the recession. And why I bring this up is because a lot of the history of housing discrimination happened because of an economic disaster known as the Great Depression. All right, so at the end of the 1920s, the roaring 20s, if you will, things went sour, and they went sour pretty fast. In a matter of a couple of days, Wall Street, as we knew it then, lost about 25% of its value. So in today's terms, that would be about, I can't do that math, 8,000 points on the Dow in 2 days today. From the top of the late 1920s, 1929, until the bottom of the stock market in 1932, the market lost 90% of its value. Not quite, 89 point something, but so 90% of all investment just disappeared. And so there was naturally from that a a magnitude of economic proportions that really hadn't been seen for quite a while. And really the topics that we're talking about when we think about racism, redlining, and COVID, you know, each of these lectures could be multiple hours long. So it's hard to get into the specifics of each of these, but let's just say it was really an economic calamity. And there wasn't really a solution from Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time. He lost re-election after a couple of years of trying small things to get the economy going, to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really tried to think of the federal government as a tool for improving that economic situation with its kind of weight behind it, the federal government's weight behind it. So again, I'll assume most of you know about the New Deal. It was really a couple of New Deals, right? And there were a lot of agencies and a lot of things that were happening. And I can't go through even these in detail, but I'll just put them up there. A lot of good came from that. You know, the fact that we can bank with insurance, because back then banks were folding because they didn't have resources, and you know, depositors were running on the banks, and you know, thousands of banks folded. You know, the fact that we have Social Security and, you know, an overtime rate, and that folks can be unionized without, you know, reprisal. All of these things come basically from the early 1930s under FDR. And so a lot of good that came from them, and a lot of public good that came from them. I mean, most of you can probably at least identify a few of these projects. You know, LaGuardia Airport, the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City, the Riverwalk in San Antonio, and you know, the list goes on. And I could talk about the good that comes from so many of these projects still today. And quite literally, millions of adults were employed by various federal agencies simply to give them a wage and a piece of self-worth, and to do something for the public good because there were so many unemployed. Now, mind you, back in the late 1920s and early 30s, when this happened, there was no unemployment. There was no such thing as, if you don't have a job, the government will give you some money. So again, all of these things came out of that economic catastrophe, many of which were positive. That being said, not everything was good. All right, which leads me to the next part, and the critical part of my conversation is the concept of redlining. So during this economic challenge, one of the agencies that FDR created was the Federal Housing Authority, under which the Homeowners Loan Corporation was founded. And I put up a couple of other bad things that happened as well, but I'll focus on the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. And basically what this government agency was asked to do was to buy mortgages from local banks when the people that held those mortgages weren't paying. So remember, big economic crisis, lots of people unemployed, 25% unemployment. And some historians would argue 50% either unemployed or underemployed. So, I mean, very, very difficult to pay your mortgage. And back then, mortgages were not like today, where they're 30 years and you could maybe get one with 5% down or something like that. You had to have a lot more equity. You had to pay a lot more upfront. And mortgages were like 5 to 10 years. And most of them had what we would call in finance a balloon payment. You only paid a little bit of interest every month. And then after 5 years, you had to pay the whole thing back to the bank. Well, when you're not working, clearly that didn't happen. So all of these mortgages were at risk of defaulting. And the government, in its wisdom, knew that that was not a good thing. That if folks don't have stability, if neighborhoods don't have stability, a lot of social unrest, a lot of family issues can arise. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation was designed to buy mortgages from the banks. So if I had a mortgage from the bank and I wasn't paying, the bank could sell it to the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They would give me a better rate than the market would, than the bank would, substantially. And they actually lengthened the term of the mortgage so that it was paid over a longer period of time, which obviously made payments better and more affordable to homeowners. So the design in principle was solid, but there had to be some practices that were involved to make sure that it could be rolled out. And unfortunately, the practices is where the problem started to occur. For consistency for the HOLC and the banks themselves, the Homeowners Loan Corporation hired appraisers and real estate investors to grade every single neighborhood, every block in cities, much like we would grade students, or much like you think of a stoplight, because they were color coded. Green was go ahead and give a mortgage to people that live in those areas. Yellow, maybe a little caution, like the stoplight, you might want to start slowing down. And if you were in a red district, yeah, probably you shouldn't make a mortgage to anybody that lived in those areas. And I'll show some maps here in a minute. But essentially, the federal government, to provide some consistency for its employees and those that it was working with, defined these neighborhoods by city. And a lot of the criteria was based on income or race. So socioeconomic status and race was really the determining factor in most cities as to whether or not somebody could have their mortgage kind of refinanced, if you will, from this HOLC corporation. So let's look at some details. So I pulled up a couple maps here. I'm going to look at Boston specifically in a moment, but I pulled up a couple just to show some differences. So in Seattle, which was not nearly as populous at the time that it is today. So this again was early 1930s. A lot of blue areas, which were really undeveloped areas that didn't have a lot of population. The red districts would be known as the less desirable, like stay away. And then I also chose the city of Detroit to show you, only because my grandparents grew up in this red district down here at the bottom in a city called River Rouge, which was a lot of steel workers or coal workers. And so there was some personal history here to me that I got some more details about as I was preparing for this. So let me, I'm not sure how this is going. I'm going to go to two different things. I'll just say up front, I'm not sure how this is going to work with my screen sharing. If I lose the screen share, I'll be back with it in a moment. And let's see, did anything, what are you seeing, Bill, if you wouldn't mind telling me?
Same slide with the
same
two
thing.
maps.
Okay, no problem. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. You're going to see my face. I'm sorry for that. And now I will reshare. And hopefully you can see something called Redlining in Neighborhoods. Yep. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kohler. So this is obviously a website that's designed for history, but also for current times when we look at reinvesting in communities. And I just wanted to utilize this page to show the maps for a variety of cities by state. For anybody that's interested, it's listed here in the PowerPoint. You can go and look. Find different cities and find out two things, both how it was rated before and what we would call social vulnerability now. And so let me just click on Boston to provide an example for you. And I'm assuming, Bill, that you can, thank you. So on the left here, I am showing the HOLC color-coded maps for mortgages back in the 1930s. All right, and on the right is what we would call today's social vulnerability index. So things that are related to quality of transportation, quality of air, percent of elderly, percent of heart conditions or asthma, those kinds of things. So it's social vulnerability. The more vulnerable you are, the higher the index, meaning the more vulnerable you are to problems that might occur, whether that's economic problems, weather problems, any kind of emergency problems, that kind of thing. And so what this particular website does, I think, is a good job of matching how things were identified and coded back in the 1930s to today's reality. And so if I just pick, and I try to make sure I get into Boston and not Brookline, I don't know where I'm at, D9. So if you'll remember, this was the HOLC graded things from A, B, C, and D, and then every one of those had numerical differentiators from 1 to whatever that made them better or worse. So this particular one is D9. So it's not only was graded D, it was also the 9th grade of D. So let me select this. And I won't read all of the details that are provided here, but show that back in 1933, it was a D9. Today, it has a very high social vulnerability index. And you can see some of the language that was used in the 1930s talking about this particular neighborhood in terms of who's living there, who's moving in, who's infiltrating. And some of this is not, I can't in good conscience state, so I won't phrase it out loud, but you can read that. In terms of who's there, what their occupations are, their wages, and so forth. And then on the bottom shows today why the social vulnerability is so high. Life expectancy, the lowest of everybody in Boston, this particular neighborhood that I picked, 73 versus areas a little bit north of there that looks like that might be Back Bay, 87.9. So 14-year life expectancy difference. And a lot of that has to do not just with that housing policy, but what we did with transportation. And again, I can't go on with that. So that's that site. The second site that I had on my slide, and then I'll go back to it. Bill, can you see a new slide now? Thank you very much. Has specific characteristics for different areas. And again, I just want to pull up a couple of different neighborhoods in Boston before I move on, because I think it's a little bit self-serving in terms of how the ratings actually occurred. So if we look at, and I'm guessing, I don't know, but this is about where I was on the map. This was a D8. I was on D9, so I don't know which neighborhood this is, but so you can see it wasn't only based on race, but Irish was the predominating thing. Jewish would show up in these. So it was really very detailed, each neighborhood. And it would show in terms of the residential stock, how much of it was occupied. Almost all of Boston, very highly occupied, because space is still, like today, very much at a premium. But then home ownership rates, right? So you have a low home ownership rate, but highly occupied, meaning high renters, but rated red, meaning anybody that actually wanted to buy to improve this home ownership rate would be shut out of the market. They wouldn't have a chance. As opposed to something like, going around Chestnut Hill, I think this area is, or the Country Club, 100% occupancy, 95% owner occupied. So again, you can get a mortgage in this area because of the status that it already is. And so it really not only identified, but solidified the differences between neighborhoods in a very negative way. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and go back to my PowerPoint. Excellent. Okay, so these were some of the, this obviously was related to the federal government because it was the HOLC under the FDR New Deal. State governments had their same problem. So when some of them, I think probably the most famous is Oregon, which literally wrote into the Constitution that if you weren't living in the state of Oregon when the state became a state, that's the middle part here, that you could not move there if you were a person of color. And that was on the books for, I think, 35 years. And there were also, states that actually voted and put up for votes, making it legal in law for segregation of housing, because they thought it was certainly at that time better for whatever reason. And then there were local government policies, right? I have a couple of new housing developments that were advertised either in billboards or newspapers that basically outlawed certain people from living there, in essence, protecting the white consumer that was buying from anything that the white consumer at that point didn't want living in the neighborhood. And there were also covenants that were listed frequently in deeds when properties were sold that said, when you're buying this, you must know that it can never be sold to a person of color. And so local governments had a role as well. So it wasn't just redlining, it was state, it was at the state and at the local level as well. And so, we have some good news, right? In 1948 and in 1968, we had some legislation and some court decisions that basically said, you can't do this. There's, you can't have covenants that suggest your race is a reason for not allowing somebody to purchase a home. So there was some, I guess, positive action on the federal level. And yet, and while I'm not trying to make this political, we have a commander-in-chief now who I don't think, at least from my perspective, that there's any element of unintended bias here. I think it was intended bias of saying, to voters before the election, look, if you elect a Democrat, they're going to eliminate single-family zoning, bringing who knows into your suburbs. And, I don't really think that that can be misconstrued into thinking anything else. Some might say so, but I think that really talks about the challenges that still exist, even though that their laws have changed, right? And when I say challenges still persist, I have a few more slides and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Kohler. But the percentage of mortgage applications that are denied are significantly higher for Blacks and Blacks and Hispanics compared to their white and Asian colleagues. And that has been true for a long time and sadly still exists today. When they are approved, Blacks and Hispanics should be rejoicing, right? We were approved for a mortgage. The reality, however, is that those mortgages come with worse conditions, meaning they pay higher rates than their white and Asian counterparts, all else being the same. And so even those that quote unquote get a chance for wealth accumulation through this notion of home ownership pay a steep price for being the privileged ones that were accepted for their mortgages by paying higher interest rates. Interestingly, and I think Bill will speak to this, sorry, Dr. Kohler will speak to this a little bit, that the proportion of higher income mortgage holders that stay within their communities of color is higher for Blacks than it is for whites. In other words, if I am a upper middle class Black family, I am more likely to stay and purchase and have a mortgage of a home in a Black neighborhood or predominantly Black neighborhood or community than a white person would in the white community, meaning they will leave a community for wherever it's better, wherever they deem the real estate value would be better. The challenging notion of this is that neighborhoods increase in value together, not house by house. And so if the wealth accumulation occurs because of home ownership, but the home purchase is occurring in places that don't appreciate as much, the Black or Hispanic family, the Hispanic family is not shown on here, but it's the same is true, don't appreciate in value as much, thereby further eroding the value of the benefit of the investment. So I thought I would finish up with this, and I think I have one or two other slides. What Boston looks like today. If you'll recall from the HOLC grades, right? Grade A, grade B, grade C, the grade D, or green, blue, yellow, red, best, desirable, declining, hazardous. Again, this hazardous, known as redlining, they you know, that's where the word comes from. It was red, and literally neighborhoods were outlined by, you know, where their demarcation in this ranking came. So if we look at Boston and we look at the best neighborhoods, right? These so-called neighborhoods that were green back in 1930s, 80% home ownership, 80% home ownership for whites, and 53% home ownership for Blacks. And that was in 1980. Sadly, moved to 2017, so probably the most current data that we have. Pretty consistent home ownership, pretty consistent for white families, a little bit lower for Black families. So a 31% gap in the difference of home ownership, which again can be attributed to many things, all right, but a lot of it is, you know, wealth that gets transferred down. So if my parents had an opportunity to buy a home and create some value, or my grandparents, part of that might have been passed down to me, whether that was through direct pass down of resources or educational opportunities that I didn't have to borrow against, or all these kinds of structures. I'll end with, on this slide, the hazardous or the red neighborhoods. Home ownership low, all right, about a third of ownership for white families in 1980, about 15% for Black families. We can see that this has increased for Black families in 2017, which is a good sign. Again, if the neighborhood today isn't rising in value as much as this best neighborhood, again, this was the 1933 coding, the value increase in wealth is not going to stay at the same rate. In other words, so it's improvement, but still with challenges. So, all right, so some of you might be saying, well, why does housing have anything to do with wealth anyway? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I can't talk about them all, but the biggest thing is you can leverage it, right? So you don't have to have 100% of the value. So as the asset grows in value, your investment in that asset, you know, let's just say today's typical mortgage is only 20%. So you're gaining on 100% of the value on a $500,000 house, but you've only invested $100,000. So that investment and growth with leverage is very beneficial. And the reality is you are paying for the housing, whether you rent or own. You're either paying it through the mortgage or you're paying it through the rent. There's a lot of tax benefits from owning. And certainly when you own the property, you can do something to it. And this last one is, it is a hedge against inflation. That as you own something, and if it's mortgaged, your monthly cost is actually going down every month. And so it's actually acting a little bit like a deflator, but rent prices will continue to rise. That's what I have for tonight. I look forward to Dr. Kohler, and I'm happy to answer any questions in between. Dr. Kohler, I'll stop sharing so that you can switch it over to yourself.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Kubick. You're a tough act to follow, huh? Not fair, not fair. But do keep in mind that, you may be smarter and better looking, but I'm still taller, right? Don't you forget it now. So I want to build on some of the ideas that Professor Kubick was talking about here. First, I want to explore a little more the relationship between home ownership and wealth, and then put that into the context of COVID and see how COVID has impacted that relationship, and to look at how it's created differential impacts for people of color and lower income people in the US. So when we think about home ownership, right, we think American dream. We think, mom, apple pie, baseball, hot dogs. For me, cheesesteak, not a hot dog, but still, the white picket fence, the American dream, right? That's of course a white American fantasy largely, although one that's been embraced by other racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. But just to build on what Chris was just saying in terms of the benefits of home ownership, I want to focus on the concept of generational wealth, right? 30% of Americans, approximately, in their lifetimes will receive a substantial inheritance from a relative friend. That inheritance for those 30% comprises 40% of their net worth at time of death. Right? What does that mean? That means that for a significant subset of the American people, almost half their wealth is inherited. And that doesn't even, of course, account for the other benefits that come with that sort of generational wealth and home ownership in terms of education, greater employment access, et cetera. As Dr. Kubick stated, home ownership, right? And well, let's be clear, for the first 10 to 30 years, the bank probably owns it for most of us, right? Creates a level of economic security. You can borrow against it, the home equity loan at favorable rates, right? You build equity over time, and that creates economic security that ripples out into other areas of our lives, social, cultural, political as well. So if we take a step back and think about wealth in the US, what we see here is a rather large gap, right? The bar on the far left is white wealth, followed by Black, Hispanic, and other. Unfortunately, it did not break out Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander here, just sort of lump them in this Fed Reserve data. But you notice the average, should say first, the median wealth of a white household is about 13 times that of a Black household, and a little less, about 10 times that of a Hispanic household. Now that in and of itself is unconscionable, and of course ties in with systemic racism and the generational wealth we were just talking about. What I also want to call attention to, though, is the bottom part of this graph where we look at mean net worth. Now, just to take a step back to statistics, median is the middle point and mean is the average. And you notice the average is over 5 times higher than the median here. What does that suggest? Huge variance in our population. A lot of very wealthy white people out there, folks. Even when you control for other factors such as education and geography, these differences still persist. Now, look here at this graph. It shows us the difference in accumulation of wealth between homeowners, the top bar there, the blue, and renters. Okay. and this just ties in with and reinforces the point Chris was making earlier, right? That home ownership is an engine of financial security. Now, there is a lot of debate in scholarly circles about this, because there are, again, here, surprise, 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 significant racial disparities. In other words, whites and Asians accumulate wealth faster through home ownership than do Black and Latinx peoples. And part of that, of course, is a function of the neighborhoods in which they buy. Part of it is a function of the equity they have in the house, but it also comes back to some of the factors Chris was talking about earlier, right? Meaning the amortization schedules, right? So how long is the loan going for and how are the payments structured? And also, of course, the lending rate, right? If you have the means to get, a very favorable lending rate based on your credit score, your income, et cetera, you have lower costs over the course of your mortgage and you build more wealth through that home ownership, period, end of story. And keep in mind, the very notion, and Dr. Kubick is much more knowledgeable on this than am I, but the very idea of the credit score contains some inherent bias as well. Now, I want to talk a little about some of the other impacts that come from home ownership, not just the financial ones. The first of these is community rootedness. Okay? That comes with longevity in a community. It comes with investing, both in the financial sense and in the social capital sense, in your neighborhood. This is a shot of a block party in my hometown, Philadelphia. Not a city known for, shall we say, its progressive views necessarily around race, but could probably teach Boston a thing or two. Home ownership and that stability of residency, of employment, of education promotes the building of social networks. Well, what does that do for us? Helps our physical health. Right? I think we all probably understand, and I know we've got a few healthcare professionals on the talk today. We understand the relationship between a strong and vibrant social and family network and physical and mental health. And this plays right into home ownership and correlates very strongly with home ownership, especially long duration home ownership. Keep in mind, though, it's also about economic power, social power, political power. Right? When you are rooted in a neighborhood, in a community, you get more of a say over how it's run, what its priorities are, and how people respond to one another. It's about community power, about building trust in a community, and that comes through all of these factors we've been describing here. Now, just to dig a little deeper into this idea of stability in home ownership, the blue bar represents white homeowners. The yellow bar represents Black homeowners. Sorry, didn't break it down further. But if you see, right, staying owner through the entire school time for children, which is what this graph refers to, occurred in 71% plus of white family homeowners versus just under a third of Black families. What does that do? Well, that, of course, impacts the education of the child, but also goes back to these ideas of rootedness, political power, social power, and connectedness that we find so strongly correlates with home ownership across the board. Keep in mind, though, when we talk about the economic benefits of home ownership, interestingly enough, the research shows us that even those families who buy a home and either are forced to sell it or have it foreclosed end up a little bit better off financially than those people who just rented the whole time. May feel counterintuitive, but that's the power of building equity. Now, housing, so we've talked about in terms of continuity of school district, et cetera, impacts education, but even more so right now, right? When we talk about the digital divide, we talk about the gap between those who have excellent access to information communicative technologies, to internet, to computers. Housing insecurity exacerbates problems of the digital divide, makes that divide greater. And you can see for every group but the top group, those who are fully paid up, every other group that was in some sort of financial distress in terms of its, in terms of either rent or mortgage payments, Black families had a much more difficult time of accessing the internet and other technologies for children's education, but not just for that, right? It's also about social, cultural, and intellectual access, right? So these factors all combine and reinforce one another. And that's one point I think we really want to drive home today, that there is no one aspect of racism in the US that causes huge gaps in home ownership and wealth. It's a bunch of factors that reinforce one another and that are reproduced generation over generation. And that's really the most important and also in some ways the saddest aspect. Now, what happens now? We take a bad situation in the US in terms of equity across racial and ethnic lines, and we bring in an important factor that exacerbates this, COVID. Right? As we probably all know, and I'll trot out a few statistics for you in a second, there are huge disparities between, on the one hand, white and Asian population, and on the other, Black and Hispanic populations in terms of all three indicators: number of cases, hospitalizations, deaths. Why? Right? And we'll talk a little bit more about the why as we go along. But one of the biggest differences is disparities in exposure. African American and Latinx peoples in the US are much more likely to be in occupations that require them to interact in dangerous ways in a time of pandemic. Along with that, those same two groups are also much more likely to have suffered from unemployment or underemployment as a result of the COVID pandemic, either because they worked in jobs that no longer were able to operate at full steam, and that could be everything from a dentist to an Uber driver, or because for health or family reasons, they were not able to work under exposed conditions. COVID has also exacerbated differences in income and in how we grow our wealth, right? The number one source of revenue in the US today for individuals comes from capital, not from labor, right? Only, and Dr. Kubick, I'm sure, could give me the exact time when it passed over, but that's a very recent development, right? For 150 years, the largest share of gross domestic product went to laborers. Now it goes to capital, right? What does that mean? Business ownership. It means the stock market, right? As we all probably know, the stock market's been going gangbusters after a huge dip early in the pandemic. And as you might imagine, whites and Asians have a far greater investment in equities and in business ownership than do Blacks and Hispanics. In other words, the areas of the economy that have been doing well benefit whites and Asians principally. Now, why is this true that Blacks and Hispanics in particular, and African Americans by far, have experienced greater impacts? Well, first is, of course, a number of comorbidities, right? Everything from diabetes to heart disease to COPD to obesity that that tend to be more prevalent in people of lower income and more prevalent in African and Latinx Americans. We also, of course, have differences in our financial and even physical access to doctors, hospitals, proper healthcare. We talked about the essential worker category, in which people of color are overrepresented. And we just have straight out racism within the healthcare structure, where the complaints, the concerns concerning health of people of color are consistently ignored more often than those of their white counterparts. Now, this is a little more recent data from the CDC, just about a week back. You'll notice, and these figures are all relative to white non-Hispanic. So you'll see, the biggest numbers here are for Black or African American, Hispanic American, and American Indian, Native American. Much higher rates of cases, but especially hospitalizations and deaths. That's an indicator that it goes beyond the exposure risk of essential workers and crosses over to structural racism and how it plays out in the healthcare industry. This chart gives you a sense of how COVID risk varies by occupation, by race. Want you to pay attention to the pink and the green in each of these. Those represent Black and Hispanic workers, and you'll notice that in the most severe categories, the one at the bottom of each of these 7 groups, Blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented. Highest risk of working indoors, of having extended contact with customers or the public, working in close proximity to others, etc. Racism bakes into COVID exposure. It also, of course, plays out in unemployment, right? Black and Hispanic unemployment grew far more than did white unemployment, and has come down much more slowly. Okay, just to focus on Hispanic versus non-Hispanic as a group, you'll see peaked much higher and has come down much more slowly over time. All right, the impacts of the COVID pandemic on employment across racial lines are severe and exacerbate pre-existing conditions, shall we say. And partly that's true because Blacks and Hispanics are far less likely to work in occupations where they can work remotely, right? If your biggest concern during the pandemic is you can't get your headphone to work for Zoom, well, you've got it pretty good, as do most of us here on this call in that regard. You'll notice Hispanics are more than twice as likely, Asians are more than twice as likely as Blacks or Hispanics to be able to work remotely. Whites almost that. And this, of course, impacts health, impacts safety, impacts income. Because remember, even when we're talking about unemployment, we still have to think about underemployment during the pandemic as well. Because a lot of people of color work in occupations that are hour dependent, tip dependent, job dependent. Doesn't matter whether you are a dentist or a DoorDash driver. Doesn't matter whether you work in retail or you are perhaps a physical, personal trainer. Your income has gone down during COVID because you are less able to provide the services or goods that your customers used to want. If you look at this, we see housing insecurity jumping up all over the place, right? The blue bars represent renters. The dark blue, I should say, light blue represents owners. You notice, look at that figure, over a third of renters are not caught up on their mortgage and or not ready to make next month's payment. Okay. 13% of them are about to be evicted, right? And what's happening, folks? Well, when you have a foreclosure, right, it usually comes from an adverse event, what we call in economic terms, right? You get laid off. The company closes down. You experience illness. I don't know, for example, COVID perhaps, right? Or death. You have a divorce, other sorts of, family situation changes. Rarely does it come from what we call negative equity, what we might think of as an upside down mortgage, right? That only accounts for about 3% of foreclosures over the past 15 years in the US. A much bigger factor is predatory lending. And Dr. Kubick touched on this in his discussion. Higher interest rates, worse terms, balloon payments, all correspond to negative equity for people of color, right? And again, I'll circle back to, some pun intended, the vicious cycle that Chris talked about earlier, right? You look at the economic impacts, right? People of color generally start out with less equity in their homes, right? They're putting down less of a down payment, tend to have less secure employment, tend to be located in areas that, as Chris noted, don't have the same growth in housing price, don't have the same growth in housing equity, and are often subject to short-term downturns that can put someone underwater. COVID just makes it all worse, right? The moratoria across the country preventing evictions or mortgage foreclosures, a lot of them are about to end, going off the cliff. Unemployment extension, right? Extended unemployment runs out December 31st. There is still no legislation in place to continue it, at least as of right now, okay? The Paycheck Protection Program, right, to help small businesses weather the storm, hasn't been refunded. No stimulus payments as of yet. All of these will take a much bigger toll on lower income people and people of color who cannot weather this storm. Remember, 42% of American households do not have $1,000 in emergency money set aside. 42% do not have $1,000. So when unemployment hits, when illness hits, off the cliff. We notice the coming storm here. This is a study of 5 predominantly Black counties across the eastern US, and shows you how delinquency rates are rising off the charts here, folks. If you look at this, is again my hometown, Philadelphia. 3 different clusters, 3 different colors. Red is low risk, green is moderate risk, blue is high risk of eviction or foreclosure. Can you guess what the predominant race makeup of the blue areas is, folks? Yeah. Just another sign that COVID has, to great measure, increased income inequality across class and across race in the US. If you look to the far right of this graph, you see those big yellowish lines there in the last 2 years. What's that? That's the coming homeowner foreclosure crisis, right? You see it wasn't even that large. The yellow portion wasn't that large in the 2008 crisis. We are, by some accounts, destined to see a much bigger crisis this time around in terms of housing, especially in poorer communities, people of color. Now, just want to throw out some of our takeaways from this talk and from doing the research on this. And I want to thank Professor Kubick for being my partner in this, and doing all the most important part of the work. First is that we have to understand that owning a home in the US is defined by racism, and it's not personal, it's structural. It can be personal as well. It's also a key driver of family wealth. both for the current family and for generations to come. We also want to keep in mind that the pandemic has impacted people of color, especially disadvantaged people of color, far more than other populations in the US. And it's probably going to exacerbate some underlying huge difficulties in the housing market. And we've already seen how it's increased inequality. So with that, thank you all for your time, attention, and patience. I want to stop sharing my screen and turn it out for any and all questions, comments, vituperations you all have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kohler, Dr. Kubick. Feel free to ask questions directly. If you want to unmute yourself, you certainly may. We do have a general question that I think you both could address to start off with here, and it's broad. What kind of systemic changes need to take place to change the landscape of housing disparities?
You're not throwing out the easy ones now.
No, that's the tough one. Just, now that you're warmed up.
Well, I'll throw out a couple, and I'll allow Chris to do the same. I would say that greater transparency in home lending practices is one of the most important, and that requires regulation. It requires, a CFPB that actually works, right? Preferably headed by Elizabeth Warren. I don't know. I would also say, though, that the biggest issue to these structural problems is cultural, right? If you're not changing culture, you're not changing the effects of cultural systemic racism. And hey, I'm an eternal optimist. If you had asked me 5 years ago, I would say that we were on a great upswing in promoting greater racial equality and understanding in the US. Now, I'm not so sure. But I do think that in the same way, a majority of Americans has come to embrace rights for example, gay marriage over a relatively short period of time. I'm hopeful that we will see a similar sea change among, in terms of race relations, which will have housing implications, which will have financial implications, employment implications, educational ones too. Anything you want to add to that, Chris?
1 minute. Okay. Sorry, there's a delay in my unmuting. I'm not exactly certain why, but yeah, so good. It's a great question, and it's the question and good response, Dr. Kohler. The question reminds me of when I used to be a lobbyist, when a chair of a Senate Finance Committee once asked a representative from a poor person of color community how much money is needed to fix your community. And the representative said, "Sir, I do not know," because the problem is very complex, right? So, so there is social, there are governmental policies that can be tailored to some of these challenges. In other words, we do things for veterans that are specific for veterans because we realize veterans have certain unique characteristics. So, veterans have down payment assistance or have insurance to help protect the lender. So there's not a reason that the government can't be involved with part of the solution. And there are, a number of other things that I could suggest, investing in what used to be D-grade neighborhoods. If you do that, you get tax credits for that. Or if an employer builds in those areas and creates jobs which create wealth, then they get a tax break for it. So there's a lot of tax policies that can be done for that. And there are some, brownfield advancements and, that kind of stuff. Ironically, I think, not ironically in the sense that it's more wishy-washy, if you will, I agree with Bill. it's really societal that we have to, and Bill, and everyone, unlike, so for those that don't know, I'm a gay man. And so I have seen change since I was a college student in my acceptance and my worries about who I am. And I'm hopeful that we will see change in society around race. Now, the reality is there are some people that really don't care to make that change, but I'm actually hopeful because of a state called Georgia. I'm actually hopeful that there was enough momentum to vote and get out the vote, because I think that I think it is the voice of not just people of color, but me, the old white man, I'm getting older by the day, that says this is not just. It's really not just. I didn't create the problem, but we have to own the problem. The problem exists. And so I have to be part of the solution. So whether that is to discount the mortgage rate for people of color and fund that through my tax dollars or other things, but it has to come from public support, because otherwise such things will never get through Congress. Yeah, it's been a very difficult year, obviously, with police challenges that really exacerbated some tension, I think, in a lot of cities and throughout the nation. But my heart still feels that the vast majority of people want everyone to be treated fairly. And I really believe that if people understood the history, 90% of people would say we should do something about that as a society. Like it's not this young person's fault. And I grew up poor. I was Pell eligible, but I had the advantages of being a white male. I was accepted for the first mortgage that I applied for. I'm not sure that would have been the same for somebody that was exactly like me, but that had a different skin color or a different last name. And so I think if people knew the history and the truth, they would be much more supportive of it. So I know that was a lengthy response, but my thoughts.
Music to a historian's ears, Chris. Thank you.
Would anyone like to jump in at this point? I do have a question if, but I want to give others a chance.
One question.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Kohler, Dr. Kubick, good evening. One of the things that, we're not only seeing with the housing situation, but we're taking a look at across all lines. You're taking a look at healthcare, and you're taking a look at, like I said, the unproportionate amount of folks that actually have COVID, have underlying type of scenarios because they didn't have the proper healthcare, or they weren't able to approach it. And under the current administration, we saw in the past administration, the attempt to have, a universal healthcare type scenario and giving healthcare to folks, it's been drawn back quite a bit. And we're seeing these people that are affected so much by it. It's not only healthcare, it's the employment situation. Tonight at 5:30 on Channel 5 News, one of the hotels in Boston is actually letting go people of different minorities. One lady worked there for 45 years. She was Hispanic. And what they're going to do is they're going to probably rehire her again. She'll have to apply, but she'll get paid at a lower rate. So we're taking a look at these employment problems we have, and everything else that tends to just collide in with everything that's going on here. And it's and the thing is, you can't, I'm looking at this, and I'm this lady that's close to retirement, 45 years. And they're letting her go. I mean, you take a look at this, you got to basically say, what is going on here? So there's a wide variety of different areas that, that has to be looked at. The rules and the regulations do have to make it an equal playing field for all. And that's all there is, even in the mortgage type of scenario. Like I said, one of the things we found here in the Worcester area, what they've done is in the poor areas, they've actually had collaboratives where there'd be neighborhoods you would not want to walk in after 7 o'clock at night. What's happened is they actually came in, gave home ownership to folks that live there, And these neighborhoods now are safe. They're basically built up. The tax is coming back in again. So, I mean, the thing is that, we take a look at it. It's, the thing is true. Yeah, it might be a give me, but the thing is, guess what? You have to plant a seed. You have to nurture the plant. And once that's done, guess what? It basically takes off and everybody else has that community pride and everyone has that respect, and hopefully mortgage lenders and everybody else follow in that type of scenario. But like I said, it's something, like I said, that has to be, it's across all planes. And that's the sad part about it. So, that's, and you see it every single day. So, which is really a sad aspect of it.
Yeah, Leo, good thoughts. I'll just, I know you didn't really have a question in there, but just a couple of realities that are related to some of the things that we brought up. So that relate back to kind of how expansive it is. So, when communities were redlined, no investment really took place because you couldn't get money to do the investment. So, I mean, that was just reality. So then along comes the Eisenhower interstate system. Guess where those were built? I mean, the vast majority of cities, the interstates were either built through poorer neighborhoods, redline neighborhoods, and the public reason was it was cheaper to do that, right? Eminent domain, the purchase of these homes, they're worth less. But the reality is because the people of color didn't have a huge voice politically, so they couldn't stop it. Those facilities were built up to quite literally keep neighborhoods separated so that, you were either on the good or bad or whatever that means side of the tracks. Studies show, and I don't, I probably like Nature Conservancy or organizations like that show most of the neighborhoods that were historically redlined in the 1930s have less tree foliage, have less green space on residential lots and all that kind of stuff. Those all exacerbate health problems. And so it really is a complex issue that doesn't have, an easy answer, a simple answer. The challenge is when the answer is nothing, right? So, and I don't, there are things that have been tried. I think you just have to keep trying, right? It's kind of like a marriage, hey, you got married for a reason. Sometimes it's not working, you got to try something, or, something's not working in my classroom, you got to try a different study habit, right? So I think policies, whether that's local, state, or national, have to follow that same approach. You have to keep attempting to make it better.
And just, I would add one common denominator for societies across the globe that have a lot less inequality than we do is tax policy. Period. End of story. Right?
Yeah,
we have one of the most regressive tax systems in the developed world.
Yeah, and so since I teach finance, Bill, and you're not going to spell it out for everybody, over half of income generation in the United States now is by capital, meaning investment. Mm-hmm. You invest money, you don't work, and if the investment grows, you earn from that, right? Mm-hmm. That is taxed at what we call a capital gains tax rate, maximum right now 15%, versus laborers going to work that, or whatever it is, doesn't have to be at the steel mill. It can be an accountant or, an attorney or the college president. And that income, because you're working, is taxed at a much higher rate, up to, and I could be wrong, I don't know, 36% right now. So, yep. So the people that have the money are making money by not working, mm-hmm. and they're taxed at half the rate as somebody that's working. And so it is tax policy. And so when a situation exists like it is, and the vast majority of wealth is held by white, and I'll say white men, white families, and they're the ones that write the laws, the tax laws at the national level, they're not going to write it to disadvantage themselves. So that's
it's your vicious circle again, sir, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So we do have another question, and because these ideas are so politically charged and these topics are so they can feel dangerous, right, to us. How do you both discuss these ideas with students as educators? How do you engage your students in these conversations? And maybe in your answer, you could also speak to what drew you to this topic to begin with. What's, where did your interest in this area arise from?
Well, I'll jump in a little bit first and then turn it back over to Dr. Kubick. I always try to start from a presentation of the facts as dry as I can make them when I'm talking about these issues, right? And it's of course difficult to divorce your own feelings from from these issues, but lay out some facts and try to get students coming up with what should be the fairly obvious reason of why is this so, right? Why, hey, so we see Black home ownership rates are about half those of whites. Well, why do we think it's so, right? Talk it through, right? Not place a value on it, but let them interpret the data, analyze it, right? And social justice has been a big interest of mine for a number of years. But I think it's probably since moving to Hyde Park section of Boston, which is a majority African-American community, and getting involved in the community here that's made me think a lot more about these housing issues and why I wanted to do some research on it. And hey, the opportunity to partner with Chris, well, that's, once in a lifetime. So damn it, I'm taking advantage of it.
Probably once a semester, who knows? So I'll be personal for a moment. I shared earlier that, I grew up poor. My family worked very hard. My father was a successful small business owner, and he had a heart attack when he was 39, and didn't plan appropriately with insurance and that kind of stuff. So we went from a successful family to very poor, literally in a beat of a heart, right? So, but I knew that the value that he created from his business transferred to housing wealth, and that gave a little bit of a reprieve, at least for a little while. And so while I grew up poor, I knew that there was something about housing and so I have personally invested way too many times into homes, really for, kind of flip it reasons. Not really, I would live there for a couple of years, and it's been, I've benefited from that, right? And so I know the value that it creates, and I also know the lack of opportunity. And I'll be clear that I have children of color, and so I worry about, will they have that same opportunity? In terms of the classroom, I take a completely different approach than Dr. Kohler. I am quite clear with my political affiliation in the classroom, and I let students know that. And often when I'm talking about corporations, just as an aside to kind of keep it all in balance, if I bring up, for example, Apple or something, and we're looking at their financial information, I will tell students whether or not I directly own any Apple stock or John Deere stock or McDonald's stock. So they know that I might be biased. I just want them to know. I don't think I am, but I try to let them know. But in the classroom, so my students know that I am a firm believer in generally democratic philosophy, and togetherness versus, one person making lots at the expense of others. And I don't hide that. But when it comes to specific topics, what I tend to do, and I've done it for a long time, could be wrong, is I try to actually create, I don't know if I would say tension, but I give the kind of, if you will, the party line or the party proposition based on the issue. So in other words, should we, if I said this out loud, should we provide people of color with a discounted interest rate on their mortgage, right? So because of past housing discrimination? So that could be a question that's up for debate in Congress. And I would generally say that Democrats would say, yes, that seems reasonable. They have been discriminated against in the past. This is one element that we can do to try to make that past it can't be erased, but be improved, right? And I would say the general Republican philosophy is, look, there are plenty of Black households and Hispanic households that have done very well. And so long as we hold everybody to the same standard, you would now be disadvantaging white taxpayers to provide a lower interest rate to Blacks and Hispanics. How is that equitable? How is that fair? Or I would say, if we don't have enough money for transportation, the Democrats might say put more towards public transit, meaning the T and the buses and whatnot. And Republicans would generally say put more money on the highways because more Republicans own cars than do Democrats, because Democrats tend to live more in cities and urban areas. A lot of them rely on public transportation. So I don't try to say one is better than the other. I simply try to say politically, which is where the change has to happen, how the parties generally view the issue. And I always am upfront in my classroom about my affiliation. So, but I want to, because I think that's the best way to learn, for them to say, well, yeah, my dad was a businessman and he basically was against everything I believe in. And I can say that openly, you know, but it's because he was a businessman that thought, why would I, working hard, want to give anybody else a lower interest rate? He wouldn't have had that mentality. And I just view it differently. So it's not right or wrong. I just want them to think about it. So.
No, thank you for that. We do have time, I think, for another question or two. Leo, do you want to jump back in?
Quick question is, do you think I've purchased homes and things to that effect, and the whole thing, you know, and I have I have a master's degree and an education and everything else. But when you go to buy a home, I'll tell you, it's the spookiest thing going on. The amount of paperwork they start shoveling across. The only thing I remember of going for my mortgage is actually my hand was killing me from signing so many pieces of paper. Do you think that it would be beneficial that seminars or first-time ownership for minorities would actually help them? Because many people may be looking at this and saying, this is scary stuff. It's easier to sign off a check and give it to a landlord and that's it. Whereas, you know, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And there are many people that'll do that. I mean, you know, and I've noticed that with, you know, folks that, you know, even educated people say, home ownership, oh my God. You know, I mean, do you think that, like I said, you know, if the government basically introduced not only, like I said, even a slightly lower interest rate, but seminars in home ownership, mortgage, financing, this, that, and the other, that do you think would interest more minorities into becoming homeowners in their communities?
You mentioned some great barriers there, Leo, right? There's a lot of hoops to jump through in the process, not just on the mortgage side, but on the whole home purchase side, right? And it's barrier of financial literacy. Often it's an issue of language too, right? But it's certainly a scary proposition. And I think that taking what you're talking about a step further, almost a more coordinated process for certain categories of mortgages, right? You know, to shepherd them through, help them get from point A to point B, that would be truly valuable.
I just want to point out, this is Erica Hollis. There are programs like that. So I know in particular of a program in Chelmsford, Massachusetts that does that. One of my colleagues from Harvard was a beneficiary of a program like that. But to the same point, where that house is located, it is where, you know, where those, to Chris's point, where the population of those houses that are doing those programs is not quite in the city. It is all the way in Chelmsford, even though he worked in Cambridge. So there's still programs do exist, obviously, but there are some challenges. And to your point, Leo, about talking to people about what does a mortgage look like, what does financial literacy is a huge, huge barrier, I think, in the community for where there's this big disparity. And I think some of this education can happen in the schools, like showing students how to the basic principles of interest. I remember before my sister went to college, I showed her how her student loans were going to work and why it was important for her to make the payment on time and how much she was really going to owe at the end, all before she started school, so she can understand. But no one explained that to her. I think that's something that we should be doing in schools, or at least at the very least their first year when when students come in, so they understand what they're getting involved in if they don't know by that point.
Great point, Erica. There was a article on CNBC today. I didn't read the full thing, but basically a survey of junior achievement across all racial groups and whatnot that said, high school math teachers wouldn't like this, but more interest in understanding personal finance and understanding financial literacy than learning about geometry and stuff that they don't think they'll use, but they all know that they're going to have to pay. And, what's this interest cost? What is the cost of money? Pardon me. So, it was just timely that happened today based on your comment. So, but it's a challenge, right? So we don't require it at the college level. It's certainly not taught at the high school level. And so again, this is family, right? If you're from a family that, was successful monetarily or economically, you probably have those conversations because whether it's they're not embarrassing or you want to make sure that your children understand, versus if you don't have resources, probably the best thing to say is get an education, because education is the biggest, closer of the gap, versus actually talking about financial literacy. So, I mean, there's plenty of people that have, great jobs that still don't know how to manage their money, which is very sad. So, but good plug for financial literacy. So
there we go. And just add, the population that we've been talking about is one that, to bring it back on the cultural side, doesn't have the same sort of modeling behavior, right? As far as financial literacy, as far as education, as far as professions, right? And to tie it in with Leo's point, all of these threads come back to tie people down.
Yep.
Well, thank you. I think, Mary Lou, I think we're out of time.
We are, I think, out of time, but this has been really quite provocative, sobering as well. But Dean Kohler, Professor Kubick, we really appreciate the time and effort you put into this lecture. It's a harsh reality that we see. And I think the more that we get an opportunity to hear and share information and listen to others' perspectives on this and try to together figure out ways of doing things better and pushing for systemic change, certainly I think the better off we will all be. So thank you. Thank you very much for the time that you've taken to share your knowledge and insights and wisdom with us. And thank you to all who are on this Zoom call. Appreciate your time and joining us. And we will have more to come in the spring. We've got several lined up for February and into March. So look for the marketing on our Pride faculty lecture series. It'll be out and about in our various newsletters and on our academic calendar. Okay, so thank you
for setting this up, Dr. Jackson. It was a labor of love, if I may speak for my partner. So
great. It showed too. Thank you.
Take care, folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.